First off, why don't you start with maybe tell a little bit about like who you are and what you do for a living and a passion.
Yes. Okay, cool. I'm Alyssa Yeoman, and I'm a stand-up comedian.
Nice. Okay, that's pretty straightforward.
Pretty straightforward. I do comedy
okay.
in all forms and fashions. I'm also a podcast host. Just overall.
Oh, what's your podcast called?
I am the host for The Roll Up. It's a Leafly podcast. And we follow cannabis news and politics.
Okay.
And yeah, it's a weekly show. So those would be probably the two things. A little bit of both. Yeah. Entertainer, a performer.
Nice. Okay.
Renaissance person.
Yeah.
Let me keep at
exactly.
it. Yeah, exactly.
A jack of all trades.
Yeah,
for sure. And then where and how did you grow up?
Yeah. So I actually grew up in a military family.
Okay.
My dad was in the military, moved around all over. I was adopted from the Federated States of Micronesia when I was 6 weeks old. And then from that point, I have lived in American Samoa, Hawaii, Texas, Alaska. And I would say Alaska most notably. Moved up there when I was 15, super formative. And I would say that's where I'm from. I think so much of my personality was built in Alaska. And yeah, so that's a little bit about, my upbringing was not your typical like military kid upbringing.
Sure.
So I will say there's that aspect. My parents are both like fairly free spirited. I think we moved around more so because they wanted to move than the military was like requiring them to move.
Okay. And what did your dad do? Like what branch of military?
Yeah, he was in the Army.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was a medical technologist.
Okay.
Yeah, now they're down in Florida. Bless my family. They're safe.
Okay.
Yeah, and yeah, so that's how I grew up. I was the youngest. I was adopted super late in life. Like my older siblings are about 7 and 11 years older than me. And just kind of had this kind of eclectic upbringing of moving around, trying out new things. Yeah, I played hockey in high school. That's a fun fact.
Yeah.
Yeah, something you would expect from someone who's black.
Right.
And yeah, so.
And then are your siblings like diverse as well?
Yes.
Okay.
So I was adopted into a family where my dad is black and my mom is white. And they got married actually shortly after the civil rights movement,
Wow.
within that range of time. So, and both of my older siblings just, grew up under that roof. I'm trying to think of what else.
Because like my baby sister, we adopted. So my dad's black, my mom's white.
Okay.
And my baby sister's adopted from China.
Oh, cool.
And so like we kind of have, at least when you said that, I was like, oh, that's like my family. We just kind of,
Yeah.
and my mom was in the military, my dad was too.
Oh, shut up.
No, they were
Oh
Navy
my gosh,
corpsmen.
I
Yeah.
love
So,
this. Okay.
so it's kind of funny that
Yeah.
that you have a similar thing there. But
Yeah.
and I know that for Hale, that's obviously a really dynamic experience for her. Just also too, there's such a massive transition between
Right.
Chinese culture and that heritage and then American culture.
Right.
There couldn't be more differences, not only socially but politically as well.
Right.
But to how she's trying to find her way in the world this time. For you, coming from that like environment, how was it for you just kind of fitting in with not only the experience of being a military kid, but then also as a person who is adopted, who comes from another culture. Now you're here. What's that like?
Exactly. Yeah. I think it was pretty interesting. I think for a long time, especially as you're like a young kid and you really don't know anything and people are kind of just deciding for you who you are in life, right? Because that's like what it's like. I definitely heavily identify with being a Micronesia person because it's always been something I knew about myself. There was no surprise of like being adopted. But then I know through my experiences, I also had to come to the fact that like I am black, right? Like it didn't matter. And that's also just like the problem is people just lump in being black, meaning that you're African American, right? And the black experience is so like broader than that, and it captures a wide range of people across the world and countries, etc. And so I think for a while it was like, what does that mean? And it took me a second to really be okay with like my full identity, right? Because I think I was told so often that it meant like one thing or another. And if I was black, did it mean I didn't have like these attributes and how to connect to like my Micronesian culture? Or how do I like have a white mom that everybody keeps asking me, this is my babysitter, right? And so like those kind of things came into play. And then I think it wasn't until college, honestly, and maybe even after college, there's a pivotal book for me, actually, after college that came out called How to Be Black. It's by Bartunde Thurston. It was a really just like, I picked it up one day and I was like, okay, let me see this. And he just basically talked about like, hey, there's others of us out here and there's this full range of black experiences. Don't let anybody tell you that you're not black because you like to like hike or you like to swim or whatever. And I was like, oh yeah, I am very truly both. And in the way that I was met with, whether it be microaggressions, stereotypes, or even sometimes, kindness because of my blackness, I was like well, can I even take that, right? And then I think that was a way for me for a while when I got called nigga in the second grade, right? And I was like, well, I'm not that. Right. And then instead of really thinking about how to process that moment, you internalize it, and then you're like, who am I? So it took a while, but I think, and I'm so glad to like be owning it and like know that this is me now, and that I can be like, oh, I'm Black, but here's where I'm from. And yeah, I don't know. It was complicated, I think, growing up experience. But I wouldn't trade those aspects for the world, because I honestly think it kind of like brought me into being like a dynamic being in that sense. So yeah.
So when you experience Blackness now, both good and bad, how would you describe that? Because I think obviously, like as you said, there's a vast quantity of ways to be a person of color, and but you're subjected to maybe a socialized notion of what this is. But also it's like, I feel like, at least for me, how I experienced my Blackness at different phases of my life, and now how I experience it, what I was trying to hold on to or kind of connect to at one part of my life versus another part of my life, and then now you, like you said, kind of get to that place of more like, bro, this is just what I am, and like this is just it. You know what I mean?
Right.
And then I almost kind of am upset. For me, I'm a little bit bothered by the fact that like that's how I have to feel about it, almost as if it's like a resignation to kind of being like, this is just me, instead of it being kind of more the opposite or positive notion of like, this is me. And like, hey, I'm a part of this thing too, as opposed to being like, there's some uniquenesses about me, like whether it's, the examples of hiking or swimming, but just the other ideas of like, I want to be able to hold that positively. I want to be able to hold that in the sense of like, don't you know Black fucking people do this too? You know what I mean? And doesn't that even just make basic sense to you? So how would you say you experience your Blackness now, both good and bad? Yeah,
so I think right now, I love being Black. Like straight up, I think about that when I wake up in the morning. I'm like, I literally love being Black. So it's true. I'm like, fuck everybody. And it's great. I think that growth is a big part of it. I think there's a moment in life where you realize that like actualization, I'm not sure if that's a thing, as much as you just have to realize you're kind of continually evolving. And I think it's the same with my Blackness in that way. I think how I experience Blackness now, both good and bad, I can go back to the workplace scenarios where people obviously think I'm like an angry Black woman, and things like that. And now I just kind of own it, honestly, in the sense that like, one, I'm not angry, I'm just direct and assertive. And if I was in a, mask presenting body, you would be sucking my dick right now. And that's just not the case. So you're like, you are like aggressive, etc. So I think now it's just kind of, as I've learned to just accept myself more, I do feel like I'm at a point where like, I'm like, this is just who I am from the mountaintop. Just really trying to be unapologetic of it, because I spent so long trying to fit into a box and people please. And I think like Black women and female presenting people have to do that so fucking long and for so long in their lives, whether that's like, in every environment. And it's like, we're here in the back, always constantly taking shit and observing what's happening. And I've drawn a lot of power from that at the end of the day, because I can see through you, and it's not my fault that you can't see me in my full like dynamic being, right? And so I think now I'm experiencing it, I think especially with everything that's gone down during this pandemic, right? And the George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter movement, I'm like, there's no time to be like ashamed or like put up with that anymore. Because there's also a time where it's like, if you have that stereotype flung upon you or a microaggression, you just kind of have to be like, well, this is what it is, and it's okay. Maybe they didn't know better. And I think now for me, I'm not gonna just like resign it for you not knowing better.
Right.
Because I'm showing up in my authenticity and in my fullness, and I think if that's not respected, I feel like right now I have the confidence in life to like walk away from that scenario, whether that's a job or a person, or a party, so.
Right.
And I think that's good. I think the bad of how I'm experiencing it now is being someone who spends a lot of time in front of people and talking to people, the amount of people who think they're your fucking friends. I got a lot of people wishing me a Black Lives Matter, and I was like, I can't be possibly the only black person you know, right? Where I'm
But you can.
But I can, and I am,
like,
apparently,
funny
right?
enough, you can in this state.
And coincidentally,
sure.
so I think it was just kind of like those, I think that's where it gets frustrating is when you get like a random text from someone you worked with 7 years ago who's like, hey, thinking of you a lot lately, and I'm like, ew, why? And it's like, are you trying to fuck or what's up? But I'm like, what? I'm like, I just don't, I think that is the most annoying part. I think people definitely take license with black people that if you let them a little bit in, they think that you're fully in. They don't approach friendships or relationships the same ways what they do if they're working with like their white counterparts or within someone of their own race, because they really approach those relationships with true curiosity about who the person is. Whereas I feel like a lot of the times people come into friendships with me or a relationship with me based on maybe a little bit of what you see on stage, but also carrying all those stereotypes and maybe that I'd like talk about on stage, right? And you're taking that into your relationship with me to assume like, oh, wow, you're like much more articulate than I expected, or whatever those like little things that people can be like,
the
oh, I would
projections.
have the projections.
Yeah.
Like you wanted me to be your like super down, like black homie who's here for you to like shoot the shit and I don't know.
And assuage your sense of comfort that like, finally, a black friend.
Yeah.
We've
like,
done it. You know
yes,
what I mean?
yes, queen, let's do this.
Yeah,
and you're like,
yeah,
I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
I don't like the same things you do or whatever. So I think that's the way it's felt like a bad experience. I'm just thankful I like have the ability to just be like, that's not for me.
Right.
So,
yeah. Okay. So then, well, I guess I'm curious about this. So you said that you like do obviously stand-up comedy and writing and all these things. That's also, I just watched this thing and it cracked me up, and I thought maybe you might have a unique take on it. Not only why you do what you do, what you love about it, all those things, but like Dave Chappelle won some big award, this Mark Twain Comedy Award, and his homie Neil Brennan, who's like been his writing partner for this white dude, and he said, you know, he's like, we tried to pitch our show, Chappelle's show, to a million companies, and they all shot us down. And I distinctly remember HBO saying to us, why would we use you when we have Chris Rock? Because there was a time in this country where there could only be one funny black comedian, whereas today, when there can be three, right? Which was like his bit on this idea that like even black people entering the space of comedy, it shows up. But at the same time, I mean, like I think it's one of the things that's most true for me is that I have obviously found certain things in black comedians that has been so relevant, moving, hilarious, educational, brilliant, relief, a sense of like, you know, there's so much in that experience to hear that. And so I guess I'm curious to you how you connect to comedy, how you see your work and art, and like what you love about it, not just in terms of race, but also you as the individual. Yeah,
so I think what I love, I mean, I absolutely love comedy. I think the moment I started doing stand-up was in this really shitty, like typical basement room. There was a dragon on the wall. It was dark. It was scary. It was a Thursday night in February in Seattle, so like total gloom. And even that day, I maybe got a smattering of like, okay, kind of laughs, because when you start comedy, most of the time people don't want you to be funny or don't want to laugh, right? And even in that horrible experience, I immediately was like, this is what I'm meant to be doing. I was like, that day, I went on Thursday and I literally went the next day to do comedy. And then it was like, after that, I've never stopped or taken a break from it. And I think that's because, one, comedy really validated for me that like, I have to have a backbone. I can't any longer, it like gave me like that catalyst to do that. Like, it's like, I will no longer, I don't know, sit back. Now I'm getting up and I'm getting in front of people, which means that I have an opinion and I can't be afraid or hide from that opinion. I also think that comedy keeps me really connected to what it means to fail and it not be the end of the world. Because there's nothing like killing it in front of a crowd of 500 and then like the next day being at a show with like two people who couldn't give a fuck about you and doing the same set that literally people were like
the other day
about it and nobody cares about you anymore. I think that like as the perfectionist in me needs that so much to remember that like it's okay and that there's like all these stakes that are in my head are mostly just like in my head, right? And I think it's just, I mean, it's a beautiful art form. And I do think it's art. I think it's totally disrespected as well, like where people don't think of comedy.
I can't believe there's not an Oscar for it.
I
think it's unbelievable.
Yeah, if the Oscars are watching this, please. Nominate me.
Yeah, but there's only one big comedy award. It's ridiculous. It's only been around like 15 years too. It's insane. Yeah.
And so there's that. And I think my place in comedy, I think that's really, it's changed. I do think there was a point when I started comedy because it feels like this rugged individualism. You're the only one on stage. And it wasn't too long after realizing like, okay, if I'm the black woman who's booked on this show, there's not going to be another black woman booked on this show. There's only so many times where I was getting better and better at comedy, but for some reason I'm still always the first in the lineup. And then you're going to put like 4 shitty dudes talking about beating off after me or some shit. And I was like, and then at that point I was like, what am I doing to make sure that I'm creating spaces for what I want to see? Like clubs are dying. Clubs were dying before quarantine. They're going to continue to dwindle because that's not how people are intaking comedy these days. And so what does it look like to make space? It makes space for like dynamic, like black experiences. Like a whole white lineup can get on and people be like, wow, that was so funny and everybody's so different and cool. And then if you see 2 black people back to back, you can't tell them apart and that's a problem. So for me, it also was just like, okay, comedy's my opportunity to say, like, here's what's funny. And it's like black people have been behind entertainment forever. And we've been funny forever. And so it's like, that also was one of the things where I'm like, my place is to also help other people find that place. And I want to do that because I do like the business side and anybody who I can help out to like promote your voice and do that other half of it. Because I know it's so hard as a creative person to like want to sell yourself or market yourself or do whatever. But it's just like not how, if you want to continue to do it, how do you like make moves forward? And you need that combination of both.
Dope. In light of all that, I think your perspective is unique, obviously, not only as a comedian, but someone who has this diverse experience of the whole U.S. And right now, obviously, the whole country's in turmoil over the events of the past month and et cetera.
Right.
And that's continuing. But also, too, just, the dialogue and how it's changing and shifting everything. I would call it a moment, even though it's spanning a long period of time. And I'm curious to know how you're experiencing this and this season. And do you feel like it's impacting you? And because I would say my experience is most black people I talk to have a sense of exhaustion like they haven't had before. And maybe we've all felt it at some level, but we had like a certain level of capacity to cope.
Yeah.
And then this kind of felt like, boy, that kind of took that last piece from a lot of people.
Totally.
And so I'm curious to know how you're experiencing that and if that's in any way impacting what you put out, what you find funny, what you can talk about, what you want to write about, how it impacts you not only as an individual, but then also as an artist too.
Totally. Yeah. I do think exhaustion is at an all-time high. And it came in such a sneaky form this time because, this thing hit and you're inside all day and you're like, okay, I have all this time and space to be mentally fine, right? But that's not really the case. I think in that way, it creeped up on me personally, I know, when it was like, there's only so many like questions I can answer and like questions from people who I don't talk to or like I don't feel the openness with or whatever that looks like. And being like, okay, well, I guess I'm just sitting here, so I guess I'll answer. And then 2 days, 3 days later, a week later, being like, wow, I'm emotionally exhausted by all the things I've been fielding. Even when it was like kind reach outs and even when it was like, hey, let me get you food and stuff, there was just suddenly this, as an introvert who honestly will only be in the spotlight when I'm asked to do it, there was also that like feeling of, oh shit, I just want people to find another black friend.
Right.
Or maybe, I don't know, hit up that guy you dated a couple years ago, I don't know. But I think that, and it creeped up on me because I don't think, it took me a second to realize all that I was taking in this time. Because usually it's like, that moment at work or it's something's happened and you're all in this setting where people are discussing it, but it's like being alone and isolated in that moment, being like, okay, this is happening, not being surprised, but it truly felt different, and it was a different way to process things. Even with people taking what I think are better steps than they used to, right? People are reading and all that stuff. It just flipped some of it on its head. And I didn't have any of those coping mechanisms, getting to your next part, where it's like, I am someone who remains booked and busy for sure. And then I have nothing but time. And so I personally like to get over depression by working until I get sick. So, like so many people do. And so I was like, okay, well, I don't have that option now. So what does that look like? It really made me think about, okay, what is the growth that I've been putting into my own healing? Like, this is actually a true test of that, which is scary, because when you come to, you don't ever want to be tested, you just want to arrive. So there's that aspect. And then as far as like my art and what it looks like moving forward, I think for me, I'm excited to get back on stage after this, because I also have jokes that people will sometimes like be like, oh, or like grown at, white people specifically. And I just am excited to get back on stage and continue to not give a fuck about that, and maybe even do more stuff that pushes people's limits in that way, because it's fun for me, and it's like fun for me. Like, and it's like, I would never, if you think a good comic is getting on, if you think it's a good comedian who gets on stage and works out all the stuff they should have been doing in therapy is funny, you don't like comedy. And you don't respect it as a profession. And so I think that is what I'm most excited about, is getting back to that, and also being like able to call people out and knowing that they should know now. Because I think you can make an excuse for an audience of maybe they don't know, or hey, we're doing comedy in Seattle and it's so white, this is how it goes. And now I'm excited to get back on stage and be like, well, yes, this audience is white and we are in Seattle, but what you're doing right now, you didn't awe when the guy before me got up, who was white, made a fat joke about himself. So why are you awing right now as I talk about this Black experience? That's funny to me. It's just crazy to me how many people want to see Black entertainment, but like, as soon as it doesn't relate to them, they discount it.
If they're not centered.
If they're not centered around it. But it's like, I've been watching boring white movies for decades. And I'm still like, wow, I fucking cried, you know.
I fucking love School of Rock.
Yeah, I love School of Rock. Oh my God, I love School of Rock.
Right? So yeah, but that's the thing, is like, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So, okay, so that kind of brings you to like one of the, I think the biggest question, which is something that is hugely important to me, and also it's becoming also one of the subset arguments inside this current movement, which is about cancel culture. Cancel culture. As this kind of reactive body shows up to these particular stimuli that occur, or these phenomena that occur in the social world, right? And especially around race. Now, someone who works in this industry where people talk recklessly, and I love that. I was like we talked about earlier, but like I was an English major, and I loved when I like, you know, you start reading and they really start you in classics, and everything feels very appropriate initially, because you're like, oh, it's a puritanical culture that's producing literature. So you're like bumping into this, and then all of a sudden something happens, and you're like, uh-oh, you like read Bukowski, and you're like, what the fuck? Like, what? Like, this dude is so far off the rails. Right. And you're like, and then all of a sudden you realize, like, you discover that there was all of a sudden this awareness of this artist license, this notion that the point of the artist, of the jester, is that ability to sit in the room with the king, and the only one who pokes fun at the king in the way where it gives us all the ability and the relief to laugh at the king, right? And to laugh at the systems and to poke fun, but also as a form of critique. That was the whole thing. It's like, how can we critique the king without him cutting our heads off? And that was the play of the artist, of the bard who sang the songs, of the poet and the writer, of the comedian. These were their plays, right? And I think it even bites on that Toni Morrison line, when like terrible things happen, this is when artists go to work. Because that's the point of the artist, right? Is to try to articulate the suffering of the masses where they don't have the voice nor the skill to fully relay that. And so at the same time, you also have this world now where comedians, their leashes get pulled when it feels like sometimes they drift too far. Like, you watch it happen to certain figures. And that's frustrating for me, because I'm like, I want the comedian to feel liberated to say what they need to say, especially because as Black folks, and the way that, like you said, you're always the opener. You're not there with the biggest crowd. Your impact is limited, right? So it's like, and so then when you get the chance to then go, and also if you could, you know, not whatever, that kind of sense that lives inside the crowd, like when you're saying jokes and people are awing, I guess I'm curious to know how you feel about the whole idea of cancel culture and the artist license on saying what needs to be said.
Totally. So I'll start with this. I feel like cancel culture and those things that happen in comedy are separate. I think the problem with cancel culture and life at large right now is that people aren't using any nuanced thinking. I think people get upset with the way, so when I'm assuming that you're thinking about like, kind of like these dude comedians who say things that are like, specifically, some that say things that are like off, and then people are suddenly like, this person has like lost the touch, right?
Right.
I think there's a lot of history within comedy that has made it okay for men specifically to say and get away with a lot of stuff that is just downright inappropriate, right?
Okay.
So I do believe in that. I do believe that people can be rehabilitated.
Okay.
But I have yet to hear an honest apology out of someone, right? So I think that's the other part of cancel culture. So someone's like, okay, they're canceled, then they release this apology, and the apology's always like,
it's soft as shit.
Oh, I'm sorry, but I can't help it. You know, I just gotta show women my dick or whatever. I've been saying too many dick jokes in this, but that's honestly my range. But
total range.
I know I like stops and ends
I play
here.
in this
it's like
field.
I'm black.
Yeah.
Here's some dick jokes. No, so I think those are actually like, I feel like that's a little bit separate to me. I don't think that. I think you should always take artistic license. Take that risk if you want to. I think one of the best advice I ever got in comedy, it was when I did the Seattle International Comedy Competition. This guy came down from LA, or up from LA. It was just like, stay true to your voice. Eventually someone's gonna want your voice. So I do think that's true. So if you're like, wanna get up and you wanna make horrific jokes about things you know nothing about, someone will probably pick that up. And we've seen through comic history, they'll pick it up, right? I think the separate thing that people don't see is just kind of that institutionalized and systematic oppression that happens within the comedy community in general, right? It's been a boys' club forever. Then when I think about cancel culture in general, I think there is a good approach. I think you need to call people, you call people out, then maybe call people in. So I think that's how it goes. Like you call someone out, I think their reaction to how they are called out, I personally, maybe not everybody, can determine whether or not it's worth your time to bring that person in. And if it is worth your time to bring that person in to educate them or to do what you can to like start them on that path, then cool. If it doesn't seem like that, then maybe that's something they have to do on their own. I just don't think it's as cut and dry. I think we want to say people are canceled. One, nobody's ever really canceled because people are still watching fucking Woody Allen movies, right? Nope. People are still, so the cancel culture is like a fraud in that sense because these people are still making money. Like if they were truly canceled, they'd be gone. But I think it's just more nuanced thinking of that. Like, yeah, it's the same thing that I complain about when I think about Blackness. It's like, are we looking at the whole story? Are we looking at like the dynamics that maybe have been perpetuated? I think specifically in terms when, I've seen plenty of times when specifically black men have gotten called out for things, right? And they're immediately villainized and black men get no backstory, right? They showed up that day, they made that offense, and that is their whole life. And that's a problem. So, yeah, I don't know. I think the thing that comes up in comedy is that political correctness piece. I do think that comedy is changing just because there's more people participating in comedy who have varying identities, and that's where people are like, oh, you can't be whatever. It's like, I'm sure someone's dad will still watch your fucking broke-ass jokes or whatever, you know? So you're chill, dude, and they're the ones who have money to spend on comedy. Why does it even bother you that, like, other people don't want to hear that shit? And how do you expect to have, like, a truly showing a range of comedy and comedic experiences and relating to an audience who can now see someone worldwide digitally if you think that shutting down this other part of it is worthwhile? Or even, like, the fact that this is happening, like, this uprising of, like, alt comedy and queer alt comedy, meaning anybody who's not a non-white dude, let me just say that, is coming up, has anything to do with like what you're currently doing. Right. So yeah, it is just like, I don't know. It's like I can sit here and say maybe Dave Chappelle's comedy isn't for me anymore. Right. I think he had really good things to say in his thing about George Floyd, right? I don't know if that was necessarily comedy, but it was like totally him using his voice to like really speak on these things. But I also am not going to discount that he was like one of my inspirations for doing comedy, and the Chappelle Show was super formative to me, and I will go back and watch those things if it feels right. Maybe I don't, like then it's individual choice at that. Right. It's like the fact that everybody's like, Chick-fil-A's canceled, but somehow Chick-fil-A sandwiches show up on my feed, So it's like, and that's your personal choice. I think that's where you got to really, I don't know. I just think it's so much more nuanced to that. And if we're looking at people as a whole, like, what do you do?
Sure. I only say that, and I guess that's part of the reason why I asked, is just because I feel like there is certain things that are obvious and like need to be called out. Yeah. And there's certain people in power and position who it's prevented from assassinating them, but then certain groups you watch get murdered for something that I would consider a far smaller offense, or not even in the same realm as this. Like, I still think it's just baffling that a guy like Harvey Weinstein was able to operate as this monster inside this major institution where there were jokes made about the like actual abuses this person's doing, and yet was completely uncounseled until it was so irrefutable that it was like, now everyone's going to know that he's a monster. You know what I mean? And yet still, if I'm not mistaken, those things are still tied to him, those projects. So I'm like, I don't think he's hurting in any. Yeah, you know what I mean? Where I'm like, you're just still reaping in that way.
Exactly.
And then there's other people who are like low men on the totem pole. And this like up and coming comic says something, tries the thing, takes a shot, doesn't go good, and then it's like, we annihilated them, you know, or this gal says this thing, and next thing they're like, oh well, she's this, and I'm like, you're like, boy, you really can't. That bums me out, because I'm like, this person's finding their feet, this person's working in an art. They're not working,
and I think that's the nuance people are missing too, right?
Because, and then also, just sorry, I just gotta say this too, because this is the other thing too. Then Trump will say some wild shit, and then it will be like, you're misunderstanding him, right? It's like all of a sudden we've turned into these scholars of nuanced thought and language, but then when it comes to other people, it's like, it seems blatant with this guy. So just that kind of the way that sometimes you find it working against itself, and in a way that doesn't seem. There's like enough continuity where I'm like, I get the concept, and I think it's valuable to try to call out those people, like you said, but then being able to do so in an accurate way where people know how to like attack and remove those voices and those concepts that really are harmful and damaging.
Absolutely.
As opposed to just being like, oh, it said a thing I didn't like, we wipe them out. You're summed up in this one little thing, where there's certain people who have a track record, who have a pattern of behavior, where it's like any human can make a mistake. But building a character around a set of harmful behaviors, I'm like, those are the people you fucking cancel. At least that's my take.
No, I totally agree. I think the problem is cancel culture is not synonymous with like critical thinking or emotional intelligence or et cetera. And I think there's also right now happening where there's a lot of offloading onto other people because people aren't coming to like terms with their own shit. So I think that's something to think about. I think social media has made it like cancel culture and commentary. It's like the lowest hanging fruit. Like, I'll post this, I'm involved, but let me go back to like doing every single thing the same. Like, the work is not done, you know, and it's not going to be done probably in our lifetime if we're being realistic. But yeah, I agree. It's like, well, this is great, but like, we still should be arresting the cops who killed Breonna Taylor, right? And it's like, even watching people's like, both my roommates were looking at their stories last night, and they were telling me that what they're noticing in their stories is people like dropping off whenever they get to like that Breonna Taylor meme, right? Like, it's like, oh, it's all fun again, and then like when it gets to that again, people like just stop watching it again, and it's like, well, it's not gonna stop the killing, and when the next thing comes up, you're gonna be back around to it, and it's like, well, if you just would just stick with it and figure your shit out, I don't know. It's so fucked.
No, just what you're saying. What you're saying is like in my head.
This like rabbit hole of like.
No, that's in my head all the time. What you're saying, and it's so hard because I feel like I'm living in a loop. Like I'm living in a social loop where I'm like, how the fuck can I get you to grasp the concept that like you would have to stick around here to like create something to change. I don't get like how the fuck are you not getting that? Like you can't make any sort of meaningful change if you're not able to just stay somewhere. You know what I mean?
No, I totally hear you.
It's super frustrating. But I'm really interested to hear that take. The other thing, and like one of the other things I want to capture before we cut you loose, but I am super interested in this, which is if you were speaking directly to a white body and you're saying like, hey, they're interested in listening and they want to hear your perspective on this, you know, anything in particular, but what is something that you wish you understood about either their experience, this moment in time, life in your particular career or whatever, just anything from your perspective where you're like, I wish white people and dominant culture, and I'm going to say the ruling class as well, I wish they knew this. I wish they could internalize this. Is there anything like that for you?
I can think of Three
Okay.
things. I think the first, going back to what you were saying, this loop that we're living in, none of your black and brown friends want to hear right now that like this time feels different. Like, I mean, like, just because you finally showed up to the fucking party doesn't mean the party wasn't happening before you got here.
Right.
So I think that's a big one. And none of your black and brown friends want to hear about you realizing racism exists for the first time. I think that's a big one, right? Because I think people are reaching out, they're trying to be well-meaning, but the pressure you're putting on the other side, and like, also, why do they need to know? Like, if you're doing any sort of internal work, like, why does someone, you know what I mean? There's people you can pay to talk to about that. I know someone, if anybody needs a recommendation for that. But like, there's that. I think that I want people to know that the black experience is not limited. The one thing that's been bothering me a lot, and this is just a small thing, is when people are using African American and black interchangeably. I think it's cool right now that we're capitalizing black in like journalism. I like that they started to do that. I also think that people need to recognize that black people just come from a variety of areas. And then I think I hit on this earlier, but I think if you genuinely, I don't know, want to be an ally, or you want to take the first step to making a black friend, like, approach that relationship with the same curiosity you would have with a white friend, where you don't know anything about them and anything can be surprising and curious. And maybe check yourself when you're going into what their expectations of what a black person in your life looks like. So I think there's that. I would say that those would be the three main things I can think of.
In light of that information, what is your hope for the future? Like, if you were to say, hey man, I guess what I would love is this. Like, you can talk about your future. General future doesn't really matter.
What is my hope for the fucking future?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds corny, but I also think this is the other thing too, which is that I think people oftentimes understand one portion of the black experience, which is, okay, maybe they want this and they want like, they're fighting, like, you know, I'm picturing this like average person who's disconnected from the experience, who's like, well, they're fighting for some sort of like equality or some kind of rights or whatever. Like, it gets lumped in this civil rights kind of maybe notion of like, they're out there again doing that marching thing and like they're unhappy again and blah, blah. And I'm like, but what are black people ultimately after? And that's different for each black person. Each black person's perspective of what hope, like what the future would be and what would be something they would want to see come to fruition. I guess I'm curious to know what your unique take would be on what your hope for that would be.
Yeah. I love thinking about the future. I think my major hope for the future would be like people realizing that apology also means action. I also think my other hope for the future is that, I don't know, anybody can walk into the room with the same awareness of like black and brown history as white history. And I mean, it sounds like that's like beyond hope. I just hope that there's a day where it's like this true intersectionality is happening. I mean, that's really all I feel like I think if you understand that apology requires action, that's like that emotional intelligence and nuanced thinking that people need to have in their approach to life and relationships that we're really missing because society overall is like just incredibly short-sighted. And I think that if we are also truly practicing intersectionality while having that, I think we have like truly a hope for like a better world where people have experience like equal opportunity. And I don't know, I just want to see people thriving, you know, and like really and able to thrive. I don't want to like, I don't know, listen. I think this is like the perfect example for me. I started that Jeffrey Epstein documentary, which I wouldn't recommend to anybody because who gives a fuck about that guy? But so I started that, and I was also listening to, I believe it was NPR at first, just like kind of in the same like 24-hour range. And in the Jeffrey Epstein documentary, he like lied to get his first 2 jobs, and everybody's like, but he just had so much charm and da-da-da, and we like gave him this job, right? And then I'm listening to Up First and hearing these stories about how people are like living in this pandemic and revolution right now. And I hear a story of 2 women of color who have master's degrees who have never made over $50K in their life. And honestly, my hope for the future is that is no longer the case. That whites, like pedophile dudes, are in power while brown and black women and trans people are suffering, and like non-binary, like, you know what I mean? I want it to be equal and good.
I want the scales to reassess who should get that break.
Yeah. And I also want to be living in a world where it's like, if I don't like another black person, I can do that. You know what I mean? Because it's like, we didn't talk on that, but it's like, there's no nuance right now that like even allows you to think of people of having like different personalities, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. I mean, it's a tall order, but
but I also want people to know where we're trying to go. I want people to understand where we're trying to go, because I think that's the thing is like everyone can get really mad and get hyper focused on this particular thing, and I'm like, man, this train is moving forward.
Right.
We're all working toward a progressed state.
We are living in a moment, but it's going to result in an outcome.
Yep.
And so I think that people just don't realize that. That's also that short-sightedness, right? It's like, exactly what you're saying. So.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for coming on. Thanks for being
thanks for having me.
You're the best. I hope we get to have you back again. It's really the most entertaining talking to you. So
thank you for having me.